I don't know how many of you guys like this. I think words can be fun. So there's going to be 2 words I'm going to throw up here today. I believe I have 2 definitions up there. There's 2 words. The first is holiness or holy. Second is syncretism. For those of you who are reading fast, you've already beat me and you've already read them up there. But when we talk about God, and this is going to be relevant as we go through this text before we start off real quick, and now you'll have clever things to tell your neighbors. When we talk about God's holiness, the exact definition of the word is for something to be set apart. Something that's holy is set apart. When it's applied to God, and when we talk about God, and we call him holy, and when the angels stand before him, and as we sang earlier, we say, holy, holy, holy is the Lord our God. What we mean is we're talking about he is set apart, and we're discussing his absolute moral purity in every way. His holiness is unlike ours even. It's, in some senses, almost an encapsulation of his entire character and nature. He is holy. That's what he is. He's perfectly moral and pure. And there's another term up here, the idea of syncretism. It's another fun word. Syncretism is the idea of the merging or attempted mixing of different religions, cultures, and schools of thought. Now, there are times that's a really great thing, right? I like sushi, pizza, pad thai, naan bread, hamburgers, tacos, jambalaya. I really enjoy pita bread, dumplings, whether Asian or Southern. I'll take them both, and so on. Art, music, science, medicine, food. When all of those things are shared between cultures and mixed between them, it's a really good thing, especially the food part, but the other stuff is good too. There's a really good aspect to what you could call syncretism, the mixing of cultures and all of that. But there's some aspects that are not good. Chattel slavery, still practiced today in many different cultures. The buying and selling of human beings. That's not a cultural thing that we want anybody to adopt. Cannibalism has been practiced by many cultures. That is not something that ought to be shared or adopted or passed to new cultures. Genocide and racism are practiced by many cultures still today. We still can watch on the news where there are times when people hate a race so much that they'll go through and they'll wipe them out for either political or racial or whatever reasons. This is not something that we want passing between cultures. Sati. Maybe some of you know what this is. It's the idea there are some cultures in the past when a husband would pass away, the group around them, either voluntarily or involuntarily, would put the wife to death with the husband as a part of ritual. This is not a cultural practice that is good or acceptable or should be passed along. Human sacrifice has been practiced in many cultures and not something that we want to share. Abortion is a cultural practice that we have today, and it's a horrible and terrible one, and yet one that we try to promote amongst other cultures, but is a terrible thing to share between cultures. There are many practices in many cultures as we talk about this idea of syncretism. I love the food, but there are some things that should never be passed between cultures. They're simply evil and vile. So I want you to keep these 2 ideas in our minds, and hopefully you see the contrast between the absolute moral purity of God and syncretism, and the idea that there's times when there are things that are somewhat morally neutral that are great to be passed between cultures, but there are other times when there's things that are so evil they cannot be permitted to exist. They cannot be permitted to pass between one culture and another. Those 2 things can be in opposition to each other. God's holiness and evil cultural practices. Maybe that gives you an idea of where we're going today. And as we look through our text this morning, we're going to talk about this idea of syncretism, the mixing of religion, philosophy, morality, And what was at the root of God's concern for his people as they entered into a land. But first, would you pray with me? Father, thank you for your grace and your love and your holiness. And I ask that you would grant me the ability to clearly communicate who you are, what you want, what's in alignment with your character and your nature, and what you've called your people to be. Help me to proclaim your word accurately and effectively this morning. Thank you for your mercy and allowing us to have it. Amen. Last week we got into the introduction of the book of Judges. As we mentioned, Judges chapter 1, isn't it, is sort of a historical introduction of everything that's about to happen. How did they get to this point where they had judges? Excuse me. Judges chapter 2, verses 3-6 are going to be more of a philosophical sort of reflection and condemnation as an introduction to the book of Judges. We read last week the first 26 verses, that both Judah and the tribe of Joseph continued to take the land for themselves. They continued to move in, and much had already been done through the book of Joshua, but they were kind of in mop-up time. They were going through and they were finishing the project. But they didn't quite accomplish the task. Today, as we finish up the first chapter, this historical or military account of what's going on in the book of Judges, we'll see that the rest of the tribes that are discussed here did even worse. But first, before we get into this section, I'm going to back up and give just a slight bit of context again. A reminder, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, and I'm not going to be able to answer every question because there's a lot of questions that come when we talk about these kinds of things. How and why? Why is this okay? And how do we think about this as believers? I'm not going to be able to answer them all today, but happy to have conversations as we go along. But I want to start by reading this text, Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 through 18. And I'm not going to put a ton of text. I'm going to be in a lot of different places today. A lot of Leviticus, a lot of Deuteronomy. I'm not going to flash them up all on the screen. There'll be a few. So if you want the notes or you want me to refer back, I'm happy to get you details if you want those later, but they're not all going to be up on the screen today. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 through 18. This is what God called his people to do as they entered the land. But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God has given you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all the abominable practices that they have done for their gods. And so you sin against the Lord your God. And already, hopefully, you see the idea of both syncretism and the holiness of God, even in this text. A holy God cannot allow his people to begin to synchronize with the cultures around them that would lead them away from his purity. So we're going to go through these texts, and I'm going to move through them pretty quickly, but we're going to read through each section of each tribe and their accomplishments here. And then we're going to talk about it. First, we come in verses 27 through 28, the tribe of Manasseh, which is a half-tribe of Joseph. For those of you who may not remember, there were 12 tribes of Israel. The tribe of Joseph, he had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and each of them, sometimes you can almost say there's 13 tribes, but they both count as a half-tribe of Joseph. So, for the half-tribe of Joseph, in Judges 1, 27 through 28, it says this: Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. So you see that the Joseph and this first tribe, in this first description, they were called to get rid of them. They even had the power to enslave them. So clearly, they were militarily dominant. And yet, they did not do what God told them to do. They put them to slavery instead of putting them to either death or expulsion. Ephraim, the other half of the tribe of Joseph, Judges chapter 1, verse 29. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Here again, we see now Ephraim didn't even subjugate them. They just simply decided to be neighbors. They did not do what God called them to do. Judges 1:30. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitra, or the inhabitants of Nahalal, for so the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor. Like Manasseh, Zebulun did not complete the task called to them. They subjugated the Canaanites, again, but that's not what they were supposed to do. It's not what they were told to do. Asher, verses 31 through 32. Asher also did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, the inhabitants of Sidon, or Ahlab, or of Akzib, or of Helba, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Again, another tribe failed to accomplish what they were supposed to do. And that's a long list of cities in which they failed to do it. So they just lived among them. Again. Verse 33, Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth Anath. So they lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and of Beth Anath became subject to forced labor for them. We see another tribe. Well, again, they decided we could use some extra work around the farm. That'd be great. But they did not do what God called them and commanded them to do. This was not an option that they were given by God. God specifically said what was to happen, and they did not do it. Verses 34 through 36. Perhaps this is the low point of all the sections that we've read so far. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Heres, and Ajalon, and Shaalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akibum, from Selah and upward. So here, we see that rather than even making any progress or subjugating anybody, at least at the beginning, those in the tribe of Dan were actually pushed backwards. They lost space and then fell into simply cohabitating with the people of the land. God's people in this text clearly did not complete the mandate. And I'll read this part again. This is not a fun section to read of the Old Testament, and so many questions come from this. Many good and difficult questions come from this. But God's people clearly did not complete the mandate to devote them to complete destruction. They didn't do it. And we're going to see, as we go through the book of Judges, that this is a problem that continues through the entirety of the life of Israel. This is not going to stop here. It's not going to be accomplished in the book of Judges or finished. But God's calling for these people to be eliminated was not accomplished. So we have to ask, and I can't answer all of the questions, but I'd like to talk about a few of them today as we look at this text to try and wrap our minds around what God was doing, why he was doing it, and why it's such an important issue that Israel failed to accomplish what God told them to do. And why did God tell them to do it anyway? We would never go to our neighbors and say, "Excuse me, are you a Christian? Because if you're not, you're out of my neighborhood." We would never do that. That's not what we're called to do now. But that is what they were called to do here. God even explains why. We're going to ask and talk about some of those questions as we review the failure. And it will help us to understand why the failure of these tribes to take this land is so important. So important. Why did God push them out? First, we need to understand what is not happening here. There's a popular term going around, and not to get political, I really don't mean to go there, but it is a term that's been used politically a lot lately, the idea of colonizers. I'm sure many of you have heard this on the news and social media and all these kinds of things. Hey, don't be a colonizer. One of the worst things that you could be right now is a colonizer, right? Is that what Israel is doing? Are they colonizers, simply walking into this land and just taking it over and saying, I want this for me? It's not what's happening here. It's not really what's happening here. See, God didn't call Israel to go in and say, you're the people and you should be in control of the whole world. I'm building you up to be a mighty empire who will dominate everything and rule all people. It's not at all what God's calling Israel to do. There's a very specific and limited definition for what God's calling them to do. Genesis 15:18 says this, as God's talking to Abraham and giving him parameters for what should be happening. Because it's not a carte blanche permission to go take over lands anywhere they want to and anywhere they can. That's not what's happening. Genesis 15:18, long before some of these other nations even exist in this area. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring, I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, to the river Euphrates. There's a specific boundary to the land that God has given them. It's not carte blanche. It's not take whatever you want. I'm giving you from here to here. This is yours. That's it. In Deuteronomy 2-5, and then also verse 9, it says this, then the Lord said to me, you have been traveling around this mountain country long enough. Turn northward and command the people. You're about to pass through the territory of your brothers, the people of Esau, who live in Seir, and they will be afraid of you. So, be very careful. Do not contend with them, for I will not give you any of their land. No, not so much as for the sole of the foot to tread on, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau as possession. And the Lord said to me, also, and this is down a little farther in verse 9, do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the people of Lot for a possession. Here's the idea. Here's the point that we're making here. Israel isn't the only people that God gave land to. There's actually a variety of groups, and he specifically designates land and says, this is theirs, you don't touch it. This isn't for you. I've given you from this river to this river. This is your space. This is what you're allowed to have. This was not an invitation, as God talks about going into this land and getting rid of these people. This is not an invitation of world domination. This is not permission for them to be colonizers and to spread themselves out so they have a kingdom upon which the sun never sets. That's not what's happening here. This is a specific, designated land from the very beginning that God said, this part is yours. Nothing else, not the whole world, this. This is yours. It's a promise that he gave from the very beginning. And then God told them why it was theirs. He actually explains the reasoning he's doing this in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 4 through 5. Deuteronomy 9, 4 through 5. God tells his people as they're about to go into the land, and Moses is sort of putting this covenant together, and as a part of this covenant in Deuteronomy, which is the whole book, he explains this about going into this land. Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going to possess their land, but because the wickedness of these nations the Lord your God is driving them out before you. And that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. There's two reasons here why God said, I'm giving this to you as you're going into the land. There's two reasons. First, as I said before, because it was a land he'd already promised, he'd given. We have to keep in mind, we serve the sovereign King of the universe who spoke all of existence into being. He has a right to give his things to who he will. Just as any of us, maybe some of you guys have trusts put together and wills put together and all those kinds of things. The only thing I'm handing off to my children is one of my coffee mugs. Actually, it's a tumbler kind of a deal. I promised that to Logan, but I'm not dead yet. So I could still choose if one of my other children pleased me more, if they massage my feet better or take care of me in my old age. I may very well say, I'm sorry, Logan. My water bucket is for somebody else. You lost it, man. And it's mine to give to whom I will. The earth and everything on it is God's to give to whom he will. It does not belong to you or to me or to governments or to people who have bigger swords than other people. It all belongs to God and God alone. And he has the right to give it to whom he will. And he decided to give this land to Abraham. And he had every right to do so. Genesis 12, 1-3. Now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is part of God's plan. Even the land itself is one element and a part of God's plan to actually bless all the nations. And I don't want to miss that. The idea of the Israelites going into this land has ties to our very hope of eternal life and salvation. Galatians 3:8 even describes it this way. In the scriptures, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. Going back to this promise in Genesis 12, 1-3 about the land he's going to go into and what God's going to do with his people in his land who are in a relationship with him. Ultimately, through this situation, all the world will be blessed. God gave them a land. He promised them a land. And he has every right to say, I gave this to you, I am now handing it over to you. This is your land. So he did. That's reason number one. While the Israelites are going into this land, and God is saying, push them out. This is yours. Number two, and this is perhaps the more difficult and dramatic of them, justice. God is giving them this land at this time because he's judging those who are in the land. As a matter of fact, God even specifically waited. He told Abraham this is what he was going to do. Long before some of those nations even existed in the land of Canaan, God explained to Abraham that this is how it was going to work. And that's part of the reason why he had to wait to take the land. Genesis 15, 3-16. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years, talking about their time in Egypt. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here, they shall come back here in the fourth generation. And notice this last part. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. 500 years, 450 years before they're even coming back into the land, God already began to explain to Abraham, here's the thing. These guys, it's going to get bad in the land of Canaan. Their iniquity is not yet complete. God knew that these nations were going to come to a point where judgment was going to happen. And as he was building his own people, as the people of Israel were populating and growing, he was going to use them to bring that judgment on the people in Israel, in Canaan. And by the time they get to the land, in Leviticus, as they're moving their way out of Israel, out of Egypt, and towards the land of Canaan, towards what would be Israel, we find in Leviticus, and I'll try and list off some of these verses, and if anybody wants a list of this, I'm happy to share this with you again. But we find this list in Leviticus chapter 20. I'm not going to read it all, but it's long. And we see him in Deuteronomy as well, and it's long. In some of these sections, and I'll share some with you, there is a long list of many things that God said were evil in the land. There is 25 verses after verse after verse after verse of different kinds of sexual perversion described. I won't bother describing them all to you, but you can look them up. Many, many different things that were terrible. Terrible between relatives and animals and all sorts of things. Awful, awful things were happening that were wicked in the eyes of the Lord. There was necromancy. The idea of people trying to communicate with the dead, which at the other end of that telephone, if you ever attempt to communicate with the dead, the person on the other end of that line is not going to be a dead person. It will be an entity, perhaps. But that entity will be malevolent and evil, and it will not be one of your family members or long lost whatever. And these people were engaging and attempting to communicate with those who were dead, which God called terrible. Sorcery. Perhaps one of the worst of the situations is that the people of Canaan would take their children and they would burn them on idols, specifically to the god Molech, who you will hear named in this one as Baal or Baal, is a new term that you've heard often. Those are most likely the same god. This is what Leviticus chapter 20, verses 1 through 5 says. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "So to the people of Israel, any one of the people of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel, who gives any of his children to Molech, shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I myself will set my face against that man and will cut him off from among his people, because he's given one of his children to Molech, to make my sanctuary unclean and to profane my holy name. And if the people of the land do at all close their eyes to that man when he gives one of his children to Molech, and do not put him to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his clan, and I will cut them off from among their people, him and all who follow him in whoring after Molech." Baal and Molech, and you'll hear this term Ashtaroth, and Mike pronounced it probably better than me. All three of these gods were gods that had something to do with fertility and bringing the rain and the crops and all of these things. Both Molech and Baal are different terms for this idea of king. And Molech or Baal were the king of the gods, basically. The supreme god. And they did many horrible things in their name. Including, part of their act of worship was to go to prostitute themselves in the temples and celebrate their god of fertility by trying to be fertile. This land, in many ways, was like Sodom and Gomorrah. It was a land that was filled with perversion and corruption and death and sorcery and terrible things. Again, in Leviticus 18, 24 through 30, God's talking to his people and he says, "Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things." And This is after listening, and if you want to look it up, Leviticus chapter 18, before this section, basically verses 1 through 24, is a very long list of specific perversions that they were engaging in. He says, "Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things," referencing the perversions that we just wrote about. "For by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land has become unclean, so that I punish its iniquity. And the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean. Lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nations that was before you. For everyone who does any of these abominations, the persons who do them shall be cut off from among their people. So keep my charge never to practice any of these abominable customs that were practiced before you, and never to make yourself unclean by them. I am the Lord your God." And here we see the idea of the holiness of God, and it's being syncretistic. God, from the very beginning, knew what was happening in this land, the deprivations and the horrors and the terrible, terrible filth that was happening. And he knew about the sinful nature of man and the fallenness and sin. And he knew that if his people began to pick these things up, they would turn out just like the Canaanites. And by the time we get to the end of the book of Judges, all the things, all of them, that you see described about these terrible Canaanites, we find the Israelites doing too. By the time we get to this book, to the end of this book. Leviticus 20:23. "And you shall not walk in the customs of the nation that I am driving out before you, for they did all these things, and therefore I detested them." Why are these people going into this land? Because God is spitting them out. God is judging the horror and the evil that is being done in the land of Canaan. And God is using Israel as his instrument. Just as many nations did in the life of Israel. When Israel itself, and God warned them, right? We've heard this already several times through some of these passages. "And if you do this, you're no better than them, and I'm going to kick you out too." And what happens? God kicked them out too. We see that happen on many occasions. That's what's going on through the whole of the book of Judges. They're constantly being invaded. God's constantly allowing people to come and attack them and kick them out and persecute them because they keep falling into the same things. The people that Israel are driving out, they're not being driven out because of the color of their skin or what kind of food they liked or their style. They're being kicked out because they were evil. And the Israelites had the same deal. When the Israelites did evil things, God did the same thing to them. One last one, Deuteronomy 18:12. "For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you." A good God, if he is good, a good God cannot abide evil. You simply can't do this. You cannot say, "I am good," while simultaneously enjoying and delighting in or even permitting evil. If somebody came in here and started beating up somebody and said, "Hey, I'll give you $20 if I can knock this guy out," and I said, "Hey, go for it, man, whatever." I cannot be a good person while allowing evil to happen when I was able to do something about it. It doesn't work that way. And God is the sovereign ruler of the universe and the only one who is actually good, truly good, completely good, who is so good that we call him holy, indicating his moral perfection. There is none other like him who is actually good. And as a good God, he cannot forever stand by and allow evil. He cannot. And also be good. And so he's using the nation of Israel to judge the evil in the land. We serve a holy God. Obviously, Israel, the tribes, as we just read through them, don't eliminate all the tribes in the land. As we go through this book, we will see the consequences where it's exactly what God described, exactly what he warned about. You leave these people here, and you're going to begin to chase after the same evil that they did. And we'll see that happen. One of the fascinating aspects of this, and we talked about this a little bit last week too, in every aspect of all of the world, there's evil. This is not a new thing. This is not a unique thing. This is not something that we sit back and go, oh my goodness, wow, those Canaanites, what a bunch of punks. How we would never do that. We couldn't do that. And simultaneously, even today, pick any one of the lists. When you go through and if you look at Leviticus and Deuteronomy and the big list of all the things, pick one. Guarantee you, probably happens within a 20-mile radius of this room. All across the world. Everywhere. All of it happens. Murder, infanticide, worshiping of other gods, necromancy. Take a pick. Go to San Francisco. I'll keep it short story. Timothy LaVey, if any of you guys know him, was once the head of the Church of Satan. You guys know where he lived? Just about 40 minutes from here. San Francisco. Nothing's new. Nothing new under the sun. But how do we think about this for ourselves? Right? We have this interesting situation where we talk about Israel and then being used as a punishment or as a judgment to go into the land and to eliminate those things. We live in a little bit different time now. Right? We as the church, that's not a mandate that we have. We approach it differently. We don't eliminate evil by simply taking some Glocks around the city and shooting people who we think are not moral enough. That would also be evil and way outside the mandate of God. It is never okay. We handle it a little bit differently. Primarily, we handle it through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we know, and we think of this, Hebrews 10:30. For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. Israel was never going to accomplish this. That was part of the point of the whole of the Old Testament leading up to Jesus. That's part of this whole thing, even though we read this text, that they failed and they failed and they failed. And guess what? All the way through the rest of the Old Testament, guess what they continue to do? They continue to fail. Because we are sinners under a curse at the fall from Genesis chapter 3. They were never going to walk into this land and eliminate the evil from the world because they themselves were subject to evil. Just like every one of us. By God's grace, we have the Holy Spirit in our hearts and our lives, which makes it a little bit different. But some things don't change. Even though we as believers, our role now is different. We're not going to go out into the world and attempt to, by military might, eliminate evil in the world. Israel couldn't do that. We're not called to do that. But it will happen. It will end up happening. We're in a unique position as believers now where God's not using us as the instrument of his justice, even though the world is still filled with evil and things begging for justice. There's somebody else who God sent to be the ultimate instrument of justice. Because Israel couldn't accomplish it. We're going to see that again as we keep going through all of this. And as we read through that text, and every single tribe failed to do it, disobeyed, didn't do it, and they're going to see the consequences, and the whole thing's going to blow up because of it. People will die, people will suffer, evil will happen. Even the Israelites will sacrifice their own children to Molech in order to try and have a good crop that year. Evil needs to be eliminated and cannot be abided. But we see a picture in Revelation 19:11-16, how God's ultimately going to accomplish this, because it was never going to be. That was what we're learning in this book. It was never going to be because man or humankind in and of themselves could accomplish it. They can't. We have sin natures. We can't do it. But there is one who will do it. Revelation 19:11-16. Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he's written a name that no one knows but himself. And he is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Israel was supposed to be the sword that God used to eliminate the evil. That's the whole point of them coming in that space, in that area, in that land. They were supposed to wipe it clean, make it new, be God's people, in God's place, in his perfect relationship with him, bearing and displaying God's glory to the nations around them. That's what they were supposed to do. But they couldn't. They weren't able to. They were fallen people. But there was one who God sent who will. Because of their fallenness, they couldn't even save themselves. The world remains under the curse of sin, and we're all subject to it, even God's people, even you and I today. Thankfully, for some of us, as God works justice through his Son, there's two different ways that God now accomplishes what Israel failed to accomplish through his Son Jesus. For those of us who are believers, he accomplished it because through the death that he experienced by hanging on the cross. See, we're all sinners, even us believers, and what we deserve is for somebody to have come and wiped us out too. It's really what we've earned, just like the Canaanites. But what God did is he sent his Son, Jesus Christ, and in a weird way that none of us, because it's a backwards kingdom, that none of us could have ever fathomed, and nobody really expected exactly, though they had clues. He sent his own Son, and the way he conquered our sin, and the way he judged so that we could have the hope of life, was that he sent his Son to hang on a cross, the only one who could actually pay for all of the sin. And by and through the cross, he conquered death, the greatest of all evils and the greatest of all destructions. And he saved us and he made us a people for himself. And he did it not with swords or shields or chariots of iron that all the Israelites were afraid of. He did it through some nails and a wooden cross. And that is how God will come, and he has come, and he has destroyed one of his enemies. But we have to remember, too, that there is this reality as well. There are those who will not turn from wickedness. There are those who will continue to delight in evil and in the rejection of God and demand to be God rather than to submit to God. And Jesus will come and he will bring judgment there too. God is the only one who's good. He is holy. We got to keep this in mind. He is holy. We have this high view of ourselves. Oftentimes we look and we say, how could God just wipe everybody out like that? And we have this issue where we think, man, I would never do that because I'm better than that. And the reality is this: we don't understand the significance and the weight of sin. If we truly understood the weight of what it is to rebel and to delight in evil and to reject a holy God, one who is morally perfect and pure. We think we're pure. We're not. There's only one who's truly pure. And so because we're not pure, and for us it's all just sort of this gradation, it's like, well, but that's not that big of a deal. But for a holy God who is absolutely and truly pure, who actually knows what it means to be righteous and good and perfect and pleasing and beautiful and all of the things that we delight in, radiantly holy, we have no concept of that. And so we make allowances. Yeah, but they couldn't have been that bad. We all are. If we truly understood the vileness of what it is to reject God and His moral purity and His holiness and His perfections, anytime we pursue anything other than for the glory of God, we are pursuing something for our own glory, and we are telling God, I want to be the king of the universe instead of you. Every act apart from a desire and from a love of God and a desire for His glory is an act of rebellion against the righteous King of the universe. And every single one of them, the right answer to that is death. So we get all concerned about this, but the reality is it's because we don't understand the depth of our sin and the holiness of our God. We take it for granted that we're going to be okay because He sent His Son, and so we don't worry about it that much. But we should. It's far deeper and greater and more vile than anything, even the list that we gave today. If we could picture those things and truly understood them in the light of God's holiness, we would all break down weeping. We should. But we don't, because we're sinners too. We can't quite wrap our heads around it. But God will also send His Son, Jesus Christ, and He will conquer evil, either through the cross, which we're so grateful for, or through His judgment in hell, which is the only right answer. He must condemn evil. So in everything that Israel failed to do, these tribes go into the land, and they were supposed to be this picture of God's purity and His righteousness and His holiness, of God demanding absolute perfection. And of course they failed to do it. Every single tribe that we read through, they didn't do it, they didn't do it, and they didn't do it, they didn't do it, and we don't do it. And it's all pointing to the fact that we need one who could. Jesus Christ. And through Him, holiness actually comes. And through Him, evil will actually be judged, and evil will actually be purged. So all of this points to a hope that we have again in Christ. And as a transition, one of the ways that we display that hope as believers, because the reality is every single one of us, everybody in this room who professes the name of Christ, we were under sin and under the condemnation of death. The sword was hanging over our heads, and it would have been just for God to have dropped it. And yet He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to say, I will take the sword, kill me, save them, and call them my children instead. Even though the evil is in our land and in our hearts just as much as it ever was in Canaan. And one of the ways that we remember that is we take communion. And that's one of the things that we're going to do today. And I pray and I hope that as we do this, as we take communion, we recognize the significance of why we take this. It's because just like the land of Canaan, we should have had death. God sent Christ. And through these things, through the body and blood of Christ, instead of death, like should have been, we have life, which we never earned, but was earned through our Savior Jesus Christ on the cross 2,000 years ago. So as my wonderful wife and my son play a little bit of music and set this up, would you guys please come on up and grab a piece of bread and a drink, and then go ahead and have a seat, and we'll take communion as we remember that Christ is our righteousness, that He is the one who brings justice like Israel was supposed to do. And in Him, we have hope of life instead of justice.